hi everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Hannah, and I did my research project on microplastics in the North Pacific Ocean. So why did I choose to do this? Well, basically, I'm really lucky that my parents live on a sailing boat, as you can see in this picture, and they were going to spend the summer sailing from Hawaii to Alaska. And I'd also had a lot of stuff in the news recently about microplastics, and also something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which I'll get onto in a moment. And I thought, okay, why not combine these two and research microplastics, because you sort of always hear about the larger plastics, but not so much the small stuff. So my aim was to measure the abundance and distribution of microplastics in the North Pacific Ocean as we sailed from Hawaii to Alaska. So first of all, what are microplastics? It's basically any plastic that's under 5 millimeters in size. So that includes microfibers, so the little hairs that come off your polystyrene jumpers and stuff. And they're either manufactured directly, so like microbeads or glitter, or it's as a result from the breakdown of larger plastics, either through like UV degradation, etc. So these are just some photos I had through the microscope of some of the microplastics I found, just as an example. So basically, as I'm sure you're all aware, plastic is everywhere. World plastic production has increased massively since it started being produced. So, for example, in the 1950s, only 0.35 million tonnes of plastic was produced, and in 2017 it was 348 million tonnes of plastic. And as you all know, plastic takes a really long time to degrade, and unfortunately usually even longer in the oceans due to lower temperatures and lower contact with UV light. And it's estimated that 4.8 to 12.7 million tonnes of plastic enters the ocean each year, and that was in a study from 2010, so it's probably more than that now. And so when plastic enters the sea, it sort of ends up getting trapped in gyres. So this is basically when ocean currents, which are these blue lines on the map, sort of form with winds, and it sort of ends up in like a dead zone where things sort of just accumulate because they sort of just get trapped in this vortex. And the biggest of these is in the North Pacific, and yeah, it's the largest accumulation of plastic on Earth in the ocean, and it's approximately 1.6 million kilometres squared. So to put that into context, that's an area roughly 3 times the size of France, which is massive, and it contains around 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic, and 94% of that is microplastic. Yeah, and that's an estimated mass of 80,000 tonnes, but because microplastic is so small, it only makes up 8% of that. So my study area, just so you can visualise it, there's Hawaii down there, and then Sitka at the top, which is where we ended up, which is in Alaska. The red little crosses, I'm not sure how well you can see them, is just where I did my sampling. And the way I did my sampling was, I had a small net, as you can see up here, which floated on the surface, and I towed it behind the boat twice a day for half an hour. And then it all sort of collected in a removable end, which I then put through a stacked sieve arrangement to get rid of everything that was over 5 millimetres. Then I sort of had some logistical issues with how to transport them back to the UK, so I couldn't have any water in the sample. So I ended up putting them through filter paper and collecting all my material in the filter paper to transport it back to the analyst under a microscope here. And then I just visually counted what I could see under the microscope. So I ended up sampling just under 3,500 metres squared of sea surface water, collecting a total of 2,322 pieces of microplastic. So that's like an average density of 0.7 per metre squared, which doesn't sound that impressive, but it's still 100% more than it should be. And there was no single sample where there wasn't any microplastic, so that was quite shocking to me. And this is a map, like roughly, of the ocean current, so and then again where my samples were. So the darker the colour, the higher amount of microplastic I had in my sample. and this red target is the sort of roughly where the centre of the garbage patch is. And so, as you can see, sort of when we crossed roughly where the ocean current goes round, I had really high concentrations. So this kind of sort of supported the theory that actually plastic is being sort of circulated on the currents. So in terms of my results, I looked at fibres, microplastics above 1mm and microplastics below 1mm. And then I did this in relation to latitude, so how far north I was, and distance from the centre of the garbage patch. I had two sort of main significant results, which you can see on these graphs. But basically, the further north I was, so the closer I was to American mainland, the more fibres I had, and the further away I got from sort of the centre of the garbage patch, the less amount of larger plastics I had. And so sort of the theory as to why this might be is because the larger plastic is more affected by the ocean currents, and so therefore the further you get away from the centre of the jar, sort of the less larger microplastics there are. And also this is sort of complementary to other studies that have done not microplastics but large pieces of plastic. And also the reason that the fibres were maybe a higher concentration closer to the mainland, so further north, was mainly due possibly because the main sort of source is from wastewater, so mainly from washing machines, so when you wash your clothes, lots and lots of fibres come off your clothes, so that's a possible explanation. So why does this matter? Well, the North Pacific is like the biggest ocean in the world, so obviously home to a huge diversity of marine species, including lots of endangered species like the blue whale, the hawksbill turtle, and as plastic production is still increasing, like the pollution in the jar is expected to increase as well. So basically not good news, because microplastic is especially bad because it's so small. It gets ingested by marine life, including birds, and also the really small animals at the base of the food chain. So by the time you get up to the big animals, there's lots of bioaccumulation of plastic. And also studies have found that microplastic can carry toxic chemicals, which is just another sort of effect on health. So not only is it sort of choking up their digestive system, but they're also sort of transporting chemicals. So to hopefully end on a slightly more positive note, the Ocean Cleanup is a project launched, you may have heard about it on the news, and they're trying to solve the problem of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. They've currently launched, there's like a massive boom that you can see in this photo here, and the idea is they just sort of let it float out in the currents, and it floats slightly faster than the plastic due to the fact that it's slightly over the surface, and it basically naturally collects plastic, and then this is taken away periodically and recycled on land. And yes, they've currently only deployed one so far, but they're planning to deploy 60 in total. And once that's happened, they're expected to clean up to 50% of the garbage every 5 years. So hopefully that will be successful. Unfortunately, it is only catching the bigger stuff, but the bigger stuff would all eventually turn into microplastics. So it's still a really positive step forward, hopefully. And then, of course, everyone can reduce their plastic impact by reducing how much single-use plastic people use. So there's lots of, luckily it's kind of becoming an increasing issue that people are being aware of, so there's lots of supermarkets you can go to reduce your plastic consumption now. So thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm a third-year wildlife conservation student, and my project was studying the behavioural observations of the critical endangered Bermuda skink in captivity. So I should probably start with introducing my study species, which is the Bermuda skink. Skinks, for those who aren't familiar with them, are a large family of lizards. There's about 1,500 species around the world. And the Bermuda skink is endemic to the Bermuda archipelago, which is a UK overseas territory in the North Atlantic, just off the coast of North Carolina, really. And it's got a subtropical climate thanks to the influence of the Gulf Stream, which enables it to have this endemic reptile species that survives there. When they're fully grown, they're about 15 centimetres long. They're not a particularly large lizard species. The adults are not the most attractive reptile on the planet. They're kind of grey, browny and speckly, but the juveniles are much more brightly coloured and have these yellow stripes down the side of their bodies and their bright blue tail, which is believed to be a feature to distract birds and other predators away from the more vulnerable head, because like other skink species and other lizards, they can drop their tail if they need to when they're threatened by a predator. They've got quite a wide-ranging diet. There's reports in the wild of them eating insects, carrion, fruit, and even eggs and regurgitated fish from seabirds from scavenging around seabird nests. So they're delightful little creatures all around, really. They are critically endangered. They face a large number of threats in the wild. Habitat loss, of course. Bermuda is now quite a densely populated island. A lot of the natural scrubland kind of habitat, as pictured in the middle here, has been converted to housing developments and golf courses and agricultural land. Bermuda has a wide range of invasive species that have been introduced, everything from the usual rats and cats to cane toads, which were introduced in the 19th century to control pests in cane fields, to anole lizards, which are accidentally introduced around the middle of the 20th century, which compete with the skinks. The level of competition between the two species is not very well studied, but potentially not that great, because the anoles are mostly arboreal, living up in the trees, whereas the skinks are largely terrestrial. However, there are reports of the anoles actually predating on baby skinks, which is probably a more serious impact of the population. And this bird at the top is one of the biggest threats to the Bermuda skink at the minute, the great kiskadee, it's a known lizard-eating bird, and it was introduced to Bermuda deliberately because it eats lizards, because the anoles became somewhat of a pest, which is not great when you're trying to conserve an endemic lizard. And so it's become extinct over most of Bermuda. It's almost completely extinct on the main island. There's some fragment populations. The main viable populations left are on small islands off the coast of Bermuda, but even there it's not safe from human impacts because of coastal pollution, and cans and bottles washing up on the beach like this can actually trap skinks, because skinks are drawn to them due to the smell from dregs of drinks and stuff inside of them, and then climb inside looking for a meal and get stuck and unable to escape, which causes high mortality in some coastal populations of the species. Now, Chester Zoo ended up getting involved with the Bermuda skink in 2013, which is when the first skinks left Bermuda to go to Chester Zoo to set up an ex situ captive breeding program, which was the first ex situ captive breeding program for this species. And very little was known about their biology in the wild. They are quite a secretive species that's not frequently observed. So it took them a while, but in 2017 they managed to achieve the first breeding of the species outside of Bermuda. However, keepers at the zoo were still having issues with the skinks, because other than when they took them out of the enclosures for health checks and stuff, because they are quite a reclusive species, they had next to no idea what the skinks were actually doing. They, as soon as anyone entered the building, they scarpered and hid, so they had no knowledge of their behaviour, really. So in 2018, they developed these new enclosures for them, which were meant to more closely mimic their natural habitat and encourage breeding behaviour, and these were fitted with video cameras to record the behaviour without observer bias. And, my initial study was going to be looking at that video footage and looking for courtship and mating behaviour. However, in typical animal fashion, they refused to court or mate at all while I was there, so that had to be changed to just a study of their daily activity patterns and their basking and feeding behaviours. However, some other behaviours were observed on the cameras as well, such as... Okay, well that was going to be a video of a Bermuda skink with a plastic food dish on its head, which it walked around for about 10 minutes with this plastic food dish on its head, not realising that it just had to walk backwards slightly for it to fall off. I'm not entirely convinced they're the brightest reptiles on the planet. But yeah, so other than that, it was the looking at their basking behaviour and their feeding behaviour. And the reason this is important is because there was so little of their behaviours known, both in the wild and in captivity, that all this helps inform the captive management of the species, enabling them to be bred in captivity with the eventual aim of reintroducing them back into the wild. So I got over 3,000 hours of footage from the zoo, from these cameras, which isn't as bad as it sounds, because a lot of that is empty with nothing happening in that I can just fast forward through. So it was a lot of that. And to record their daily activity patterns, I sampled 5 minutes of footage every 30 minutes and simply recorded whether there were skinks active during that time or not. And then this accumulated over time to generate a sort of cumulative activity. Basking behaviour was just, and feeding behaviour was just continuous, going through the footage, recording the time, what individual was feeding, and the type of food that was consumed, or with the baskings, the start time, the end time, and the duration of basking events. So the results, the activity patterns in general were bimodal, which means that there were 2 main peaks of activity during the day. In this particular case, there's 3, but this is from one of the particular pairs, and overall there's a peak in the morning when the skinks first emerge to bask, and then this kind of levels off around midday and then rises again in the afternoon. And this is similar to what's been reported in the wild on Bermuda, which is good because it shows the skinks, even though they're in captivity, are maintaining behavioural patterns that would exist in the wild. Most of the basking behaviour was concentrated during the morning, as you'd expect, when they first get up. Oh, and another thing to note is that there are little peaks of activity, not much, but there was small amounts of activity during the night as well, which has never been recorded for the species before. All the published literature suggested it was purely diurnal, and yet here they were at the zoo just being active during the night to a certain extent. The feeding results, there was limited consumption of live food at the zoo. The keepers had been feeding them crickets and stuff, and they hadn't been seeing any crickets around in the enclosures, which made them think they were eating them, but what the crickets were actually doing was hiding out and coming out at night when the keepers weren't looking. And there was very little record of these skinks actually feeding on live food. Most of it was a fruit-based diet that they were eating. Oh yeah, so in conclusion, the activity patterns resemble those of wild skinks, which is hopefully an indication that individuals from this population can be used for reintroduction in the future. And, did I talk about this? Yeah, there was some variation between male and female basking, with the males basking more in the morning than the females were proportionally. And I suspect this is probably due to some sort of dominance, with the males being more dominant over the females and just excluding them from basking at these optimal times, so the females have to wait until the male has achieved the adequate body temperature before they can start basking. And yeah, the feeding results show that perhaps more variation in their diet is needed at the zoo, because they weren't eating the crickets, which were the main live food they were offered. So there's reports of them in the wild eating various species of ants and cockroaches and beetles. So perhaps using different feeder species at the zoo may result in more uptake of live food in the future. That's it.
Good evening. Hi. My name's Jimmy Rutherford. I'm a third-year student on the wildlife conservation course here. at the University of Kent. And my research for my dissertation was looking at whether or not zoos have actually had an influence on people's knowledge and attitude towards charismatic and uncharismatic species in their collections. And so why did I pick this? Well, I've always had an interest in zoos and going to zoos ever since I was very little. But one thing that stuck in my head for quite a while was when I was little. I was about 8, and I was at a zoo, and there was a mother with a child like this, and then there was a lion just about 2 meters away. And I thought, okay, and then she just sort of, she said, oh yeah, hey, look at the tiger. But meanwhile, there was a sign right in front of her, about a metre away, that said lion in bold capitals. And I just found that a bit odd, that there is this information right in front of you, but there's no one's taking it in. And it is a problem, because in zoos there is the potential to actually teach people stuff. Nowadays we're getting more and more visitors going to zoos. In 2008 there was 700 million people going. And it raises substantial funds for conservation. And the modern reasons as to why zoos exist, they try and justify their existence for entertainment, but also for conservation, research, and education as well. And so in this talk, I will basically be focusing on educational tools, which in this instance would be talks, signs, guided tours, guidebooks, and animal experiences or animal encounters. And as well as this, I'm looking at the difference between charismatic and uncharismatic species. So in this instance, these are the 10 that people tend to focus on in surveys. You've got your elephants, your tigers, your gorillas, your lions. But the reasons what makes these species appealing to people is their aesthetic value. So, for example, we know tigers, they are beautiful, they're charismatic, in that they are large, they're ferocious. They're forward-facing eyes, that's quite a big, seems to be quite a consistent variable when people think of things as being charismatic. And then also historical or cultural value. We see gorillas a lot in King Kong or in Tarzan or Planet of the Apes. And then their distinctiveness, how recognisable they are. So, for example, the panda, it's black and white, it's got those nice little eye patches, we know what they look like. And so what did I want to find out? So I wanted to know, what is the difference between how much people know about charismatic species versus those about uncharismatic species? And I wanted to know, do people actually learn anything at all when they go to a zoo? And I wanted to see which of those educational tools that I mentioned earlier, to see if I could find out which one works best. And then finally, I wanted to see if those educational tools actually influenced what people feel their money should be directed towards. So, if there is a particularly endangered species, have they learned that actually that requires priority over others? And so what did I do? I conducted at a major UK zoo, and it was basically a questionnaire that was distributed to those at the entrance and those that had already been around the zoo itself. And then I was comparing those. And then this was later analysed using parametric and non-parametric tests, but I think for the sake of your sanity, I'm not going to go into those. So those are the examples of the uncharismatic species. So I had Pallas cat, lion-tailed macaque, and eastern bongo. And then they would have the quiz questions on those. It was simple stuff, things like, where does it live, what does it eat, what threats does it face out in the wild, really simple stuff. And then I would compare that with the charismatic species, which were the tiger, the gorilla, and the eastern black rhinoceros. And so the results were pretty mixed. Overall visitor engagement with educational tools was pretty low. And the reason possibly for this is that actually people don't actually go there to learn. Some of the literature has said that, people go there to learn, to educate themselves at first for knowledge, supposedly. But mine was more or less consistent with others, which suggested that people go there for a fun day out, to get rid of the kids for a few hours. And this was further supported by less than 2% of people actually going to the education centre. And so the learning outcomes were that, so surprise, surprise, there was a massive difference between the knowledge of charismatic species and uncharismatic species. But then when I looked and I compared those that had been around the zoo and supposedly learned stuff, there was absolutely no difference between those that had been around the zoo and those that had not. In fact, people just coming through the entrance supposedly knew more, even though it wasn't significant. And then I thought, okay, I'll go into greater detail. What educational tool actually works best? And looking, I sort of based it on those who had picked the tiger and the gorilla. And between those and the people going around the entrance and the scores, and there was no difference whatsoever. And so I thought, okay, is there any difference? Has it influenced at all those that have? I'm sorry if that looks really complicated. It's a bit mix and match. I thought, have they been influenced at all in what they feel the money should go towards? You know, for example, on that list, I would say, yeah, probably the mullet gibbon would need the money the most, and then things like the leopard with necks, it's a North Chinese leopard, and a hog deer as being the most threatened species on there. But it was unanimously that people would go for, yeah, of course, the leopard and the elephant first, and then another cat. Cats seem to be really, really popular, and this is in previous literature as well. And then the gibbons and the Jala baboons and the hog deer were absolutely last. In fact, the hog deer is right at the top, and barely anyone picked it. It was almost unanimously, like, no one cared about it at all. And so, concluding remarks, yeah, it's pretty much consistent with previous literature. Yeah, the charismatic species do appeal to people more. Educating people in this manner has little impact at all, and that really, if we are actually going to have an influence on people, then yeah, we need to really put more effort and find new innovative ways to engage people and educate people, but also do it in a way that they don't feel that they're learning, because obviously the main reason why people go is to actually have a good day and not to learn. Thank you very much.